What better place to check out how our renewable energy revolution is coming along than a solar festival in the Green Mountain state of Vermont, powered by 100% solar energy. I was having fun and got a chance to ask about getting solar panels installed.
You can keep adding, so maybe every time you get a tax return, buy another solar panel.
But then a little rain began to fall. My cameraman noticed some commotion behind the stage.
Did you guys set up here? Our bio needs the generators in case we lose the power. Oh, so the festivals run off solar energy primarily? Primarily. We do need to bring some of this stuff in just because we want to make sure we have enough power to not kill our fancy toys that we have lighting the stage.
But the biofuel generator wasn't enough, so they wound up plugging into the electrical grid that we all use.
The other inverter operating, it's actually pulling power in from the grid, charging the batteries. It's running backwards from the way we originally intended to do it, but...
Green activists across the country cheered when newly elected President Barack Obama rolled out $1 trillion stimulus package with nearly $100 billion for green energy. Green was finally ramping up, and everyone wanted to be part of it. Investors came forward.
Investor Vinod Khosla, known as the father of the clean tech revolution, has poured over $1 billion of his own money into some 50 energy startups.
Major banks were eager to get involved.
By 2020, we think renewables will require $395 billion on an annual basis.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was both on the board of major environmental organizations and was leading a green energy investment group.
We build wind farms, we build solar farms. Once you build our plant, it's free energy forever.
Michigan had been hit hard by the Great Recession, and hundreds of millions of dollars in green stimulus money was arriving. Now, to do their part for the new green economy, General Motors introduced a new line of electric vehicles. When the Chevy Volt was ready for release, I attended their press conference.
So what's charging the batteries right now? What's the source of
Well,
electricity?
here, it's coming from the building.
I mean, is it, what's our mix of power?
Oh, actually, Lansing feeds the building.
What's that?
Lansing feeds power to the building.
It would be charging off our grid, which is about 95% coal.
How long do you think it'll be before there's a solar and wind powered grid?
Oh, golly.
To suggest that all of the power used for these cars will be generated from wind and solar in the very near future would not be correct. In fact, we're talking about charging these up at night, so there won't be any solar at that time. So we're down to wind, and very often at night the wind does fall off. So
I decided to take him up on his offer to check out their football field-sized solar array right down the street.
What we're trying to do with this kind of a tour is get a sense for what they've already done as an indication of what we could do to push the envelope even further.
We took a hard look at wind and determined that, around here there's not any real good wind coming through all the time. That's what we liked about solar. You would get the power when you most needed it. Pass these around, look at them. They are pliable. Made in Michigan, that was another good thing. Although the efficiency of these panels is only about just under 8%.
How many homes would this array provide electricity for?
The standard answer that we tell everybody is we're providing enough to meet the peak requirements of 50 homes. However, for most of the people that look at it a little bit closer, we generate about 64,000 kilowatt hours a year. Our average customer uses about 6,000 kilowatt hours a year. 6,000 into 64 is just a little over 10. We can meet the energy requirements for 10 homes over a year.
As a consequence of the big push for green energy, wind farms were rising around the nation, including near my home in northern Michigan.
We've done coal and nuclear for years. We've been trying to get in more into the renewable side. These are the largest in Michigan. I think it's 482 foot total. How many yards of concrete? There's 800 yards of concrete in the base, right around 140 tons of resteel.
What are those blades made out of?
That's all fiberglass and balsam. They're about 36,000 pounds a piece. This tower will weigh 800,000 pounds when we're done. Then the cell is 220,000 pounds, and the hub and rotor assembly is another 160. It's pretty substantial.
They were impressive machines. But is it possible for machines made by industrial civilization to save us from industrial civilization? In environmental leader Bill McKibben's home state of Vermont, the Green Mountain State, a site was being cleared for the installation of wind turbines. A group of citizens was concerned about how the construction might affect the mountains they love. I joined them for a tour.
It's going to be 21 turbines.
21.
Yeah.
On this
In this project. Yeah. The estimate was maybe there would be 3 full-time jobs.
If the goal is to try to make Vermont the leader in climate change, I appreciate looking to the sky in the hopes that we can do that. But more importantly, I'm personally looking at the ground thinking this is not the kind of legacy I'd want to leave to my kids. When I was a kid, we'd go hiking in these woods. We would be able to drink from the waters down the hill here, and now you have to question that. And how long are these towers supposed to last?
20-something years. 20
I know.
I'm in a strange position. I'm against our addiction to fossil fuels and have long been a fan of green energy. But everywhere I encountered green energy, it wasn't what it seemed.
This is like a perpetual energy battery.
And where do you get the hydrogen from?
The hydrogen, hydrogen is sourced from any hydrocarbon material. So you can get it from natural gas. You can get it from any petroleum or oil-based product material.
Ethanol plants also seem to have a secret ingredient.
This is the most productive farmland in the world, and we're not that far west of the biggest coal mines in the world as well. So bring the two together and get an ethanol plant.
Great. So ethanol was reliant on 2 things: a giant fossil fuel-based industrial agricultural system to produce corn, and even more fossil fuels in the form of coal. All of this in the attempt to replace fossil fuels? It was enough to make my head explode. I was getting the uneasy feeling that green energy was not going to save us.
One of the most dangerous things right now is the illusion that alternative technologies like wind and solar are somehow different from fossil fuels. Well, I hear a lot of the times that solar cells are made out of sand. They don't use sand at all. So they use, I'll show you what they, so this is one of the ingredients. It's actually mined quartz.
Spruce Pine, North Carolina, regarded as the finest source of high-purity quartz in the world for semiconductor, solar, and communication applications.
But you can't use sand because sand has too many impurities. So you start with a very high-quality quartz and a very high-quality coal. And then you put those two together into an arc furnace and you melt them.
The quartz is then melted with coal in a large furnace at temperatures of up to 1,800 degrees.
So you need more coal to do that. So I'll get another coal out. So when we melt these together, we get silicon metal and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide just goes off and you got rid of the carbon, you're left with silicon metal. This is not clean coal.
Not clean coal. Ozzie Zenner said it was an illusion that renewables were replacing coal or any fossil fuel. Environmental groups continued telling a different story.
Since you can't replace a coal plant with solar, they're actually replacing the coal plant with 2 natural gas plants. And natural gas is a fossil fuel.
Like, where do solar panels come from?
Well, you have to start with a mine.
Or, what's stopping us from running the world on 100% solar and wind?
Well, intermittency is one of the major challenges with
grid stability.
The sun's everywhere except when it's not there.
There's a lot of developers that were flocking to California wanting to connect their solar farms and wind farms. The utilities would turn to me and my team to help them look at what the impact to their grid would be.
When we add solar cells or wind turbines to a grid, do we get to shut off a coal plant?
That's certainly the goal. The problem is, or the difference is that renewables are intermittent. All of a sudden a cloud cover could come over and your solar generation could drastically decrease. And if you don't have something else there to meet whatever the load is at that moment, then you're going to have power outages.
So we don't get to turn a fossil fuel power plant off when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing?
Well, it's not that easy. We need to be able to back up that power to keep the system steady all the time so it doesn't collapse. Most likely that's through fast-acting gas plants, but also what we call the baseload plants, either nuclear or coal, that are on all the time, but that maybe can be dialed down during the day and dialed up when demand starts rising.
Does it affect the efficiency to turn fossil fuel power plants on and off?
Oh yeah, they don't like to be dialed up and down. It does make, that's wear and tear for them.
Turning them on, turning it off, there's energy used and lost in any time. Kind of like when you turn on your car and off, you use a little extra gas to get it turned on. I do still think you have to maintain a base load of some kinds.
What's the solution then?
You need energy storage.
Without storage,
if you can store the energy that's created off of things that are intermittent, like solar and wind, you can store that.
But would adding storage like batteries increase the carbon footprint?
Yeah, absolutely.
When I looked up how much battery storage there is, it was less than 0.1% of what's needed. In a couple years, they begin to degrade and need to be replaced a few years later. I learned that the solar panels don't last forever either.
Some solar panels are built to last only 10 years, so that it's not as if you get this just magic free energy, right?
Well, we're basically just being fed a lie. For instance, you'll hear about Germany running on wind and solar. But Germany is still Europe's largest consumer of coal.
Aber wenn in dieser Region die meiste Kohle gefördert wird, dann ist ja auch hier der größte CO2-Ausstoß.
Only a small fraction of their energy actually comes from wind and solar. In fact, Germany just built a large terminal to import natural gas from the United States. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, when he announced his Gigafactory battery plant, he said it would power itself with wind and solar energy.
Through a combination of geothermal, wind, and solar, it will produce all the energy that it needs.
But in fact, it has lines connecting it to the same electrical grid that we're all connected to. Electric cars, wind turbines, and solar panels use rare earth metals. And in fact, the rare earth mine is right up the street from here. In mining these deep deposits, about 90% of what they pull up out of the ground contains uranium, thorium, and low level of other radionuclides. Radioactive waste that has to be disposed of somehow. They kind of turn it into a paste and spread it over the desert floor. Tesla's electric cars are built with aluminum, which uses 8 times more energy to manufacture than steel. They use lithium, which also rely on toxic mining, and even more graphite, which is one of the rarest forms of carbon. In fact, the investors wanted to open several new graphite mines after Tesla announced the Gigafactory. Apple claims to be 100% renewable.
We now run Apple on 100% renewable energy. All of our facilities worldwide.
And they did chop down a forest to put up solar panels near their North Carolina plant. But they didn't disconnect from the grid, and they can't.
Duke says energy-hungry companies like Apple can never go entirely off the grid.
They're still hooked up to our grid.
Despite all of the claims, I haven't found a single entity anywhere in the world that's running on 100% solar and wind alone.
So after all the mining, the fossil fuels, the toxins, the environmental destruction, here's what happens next. Only a few years after it was built, things at Ivanpah began to fall apart. Broken mirrors littered the desert. Yes, these giant solar and wind technology installations may last only a few decades, then tear it down and start all over again, if there's enough planet left. It was becoming clear that what we have been calling green, renewable energy and industrial civilization are one and the same. Desperate measures not to save the planet, but to save our way of life. Desperate measures, rather than face the reality, humans are experiencing the planet's limits all at once.
Every different perspective I look at and imagine, well, we could do more of this or go to a larger area or use more of that. Well, it turns out there isn't more. I looked at marine production and fish production and found that peaked 20 years ago. More and more of what we eat is from fish farming. The current acres of actively farmed land, that is peaked also. The rivers are already being irrigated to about the limits of what they can sustain. The Colorado River doesn't get to the ocean anymore. Well, then you start looking at groundwater, the southern Great Plains, and I think they can almost predict when they will run out of groundwater, and it's in a decade or two.
Though each of them takes climate change seriously, every expert I talked to wanted to bring my attention to the same underlying problem.
There are too many human beings using too much too fast.
As a global community, we really have got to start dealing with the issue of population.
It took modern humans tens of thousands of years to reach a population of 700 million. And then we tapped into millions of years of stored energy known as fossil fuels. Our human population exploded. It increased by 10 times in a mere 200 years. Our consumption has also exploded, on average 10 times per person, and many times more in the Western world. You put the two together, the result is a total human impact 100 times greater than only 200 years ago. And that is the most terrifying realization I have ever had. So why are bankers, industrialists, and environmental leaders only focused on the narrow solution of green technology? Is it the profit motive? And why, for most of my life, have I fallen for the illusion green energy would save us?
They claim they're just using forest residues, but actually a great deal of what the McNeil facility and lots of biomass facilities burn is whole trees. And as you can see by this pile that's stacked right outside of the facility, these are trees.
It turns out that the biggest source of green energy in Vermont is something called biomass, burning trees to create electricity.
You got everything here. So you have the number one polluter in the state that people think emits magical fairy dust from the smokestack. The reality is what you have is a facility that burns 400,000 green tons a year of trees. Now, this facility burns 30 cords of wood per hour.
That's a hell of a lot of wood.
And on top of that, it actually burns natural gas as well.
And to think you would have to have 10 of these to replace one average coal-fired power plant. It's just not going to work.
It's just nuts. It takes a great deal of fossil fuels to cut down all of these trees, to truck them in, to use the big machinery to dump the wood chips everywhere. So the idea that somehow this is not anything to do with fossil fuels just doesn't even make any sense. It couldn't happen without fossil fuels, in fact.
How did the environmental groups get pulled into this?
Obviously, the main factor is delusion.
I discovered biomass plants were not even always biomass plants.
This is actually a solid waste incinerator that's posing as a biomass plant. The impact on this community is severe.
How do you know they're polluting? Can you see it
We
ever?
can see it. The snow at the elementary school and at the preschool is covered with black, some kind of black soot. We just had it analyzed and it came back as mostly tire chips. They have to add tire-derived fuel to raise the temperature of the fire, because anybody who's tried to burn green wood or wet wood knows that it doesn't burn very well.
In Detroit, an incinerator that burned garbage was considered green.
The Detroit incinerator is known to emit horrible smells and pollutants that neighbors say make them feel sick and put their health at risk.
It's a stink. It's a horrendous stink.
A proposed biofuel plant for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan would consume trees from tens of thousands of square miles.
In order to create 40 million gallons of ethanol, they were going to have to use up over 1 million tons of green wood. We pointed out that they were going to be using more natural gas than they were going to be creating ethanol to displace the natural gas.
These are the biomass and biofuel plants across the U.S. How did this happen? Biomass, especially when you add in biofuels, is by far the largest portion of green energy around the world. The only reason we've been force-fed the story climate change plus renewables equals worse saved is because billionaires, bankers, and corporations profit from it. And the reason we're not talking about overpopulation, consumption, and the suicide of economic growth is that would be bad for business. Billionaires were in love with the idea of turning what was left of nature into green profits. So when you divest from fossil fuels and invest in green funds, what are you investing in? I took a deep dive into Securities and Exchange Commission filings to find out. For instance, in the Green Century funds, recommended by 350.org and Bill McKibben, I found less than 1% solar and wind, and 99% things like mining, oil and gas infrastructure companies, including a tar sands exploiter, McDonald's, one of the companies driving meat consumption across the planet, Archer Daniels Midland, one of the world's largest producers of biofuel, Coca-Cola, the largest creator of plastic pollution on Earth, logging and paper companies, including one that brags about biomass burning, and banks. Lots of banks, including BlackRock, the largest financer of deforestation on Earth.
The business that they're engaged in is actually destroying our life support system.
The Sierra Club also partners with a green fund called Aspiration. Aspiration also includes dozens of companies profiting from the destruction of the planet, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, Chesapeake Energy.
In order to maximize the production potential of the well, the shale formation will be hydraulically fractured.
The Russian gas giant Gazprom.
Gazprom owns the world's largest explored gas reserves, 36 trillion cubic meters.
And in perhaps the most bizarre twist of all, the Sierra Club's Green Fund's biggest holding is Enviva, the world's largest consumer of forests, to be incinerated in green energy biomass plants.
I need to thank Building Energy, which provided so much solar power to this that we've powered the entire event with solar energy.
But when I went backstage to see what was really going on,
You ain't running this whole thing on that, Jack. I can tell you that. The toaster is 1,200 watts. So that run right there could run a toaster.
I found the installer.
Hi.
Are they running the festival on these solar panels?
The concert is run by diesel generation system. They didn't ask us to energize the concert.
Oh, okay. We humans must accept that infinite growth on a finite planet is suicide. We must accept that our human presence is already far beyond sustainability and all that that implies. We must take control of our environmental movement and our future from billionaires and their permanent war on planet Earth. They are not our friends. Less must be the new more. And instead of climate change, we must at long last accept that it's not the carbon dioxide molecule destroying the planet. It's us.